Welcome to Lisbon. It's really good to have you. Miguel is a public figure in many fronts, as a scholar, as an EU high officer, as a politician, as a former minister, as a political commentator, national, and as a sports fan of the second best club in Portugal, and as a restaurant connoisseur. You will hear from Miguel on the first couple of fronts, but I have to let you know how important the last part was, because the restaurant front did lead him to be here with us. On the day Porfirio and I were discussing who would be the best person to address this keynote speech, and we come up with Miguel's name was our first name, and so I left the office trying to find a way to get in touch with him. We all knew him from the television, we all knew him from the commentators, we all knew him from his writings, but we had to find a way how to get to him. So I left for lunch. I went to this nice Japanese restaurant. When I got in, table number 7, Miguel was there with a common friend, which happens to be a fan of the first football club in Portugal. And I said, this is really amazing. I couldn't believe it. I've never seen him in this restaurant, a restaurant to which I go quite often. And there he was. So not only he was there, but he was there with someone I could relate to. So that for me was that he was meant to be, and this was more than a coincidence. This was something that we would call father or destiny here in Portugal. So it was, I tend to think, written in the sushi that Miguel would be here. And the fact that we were going to listen to him and we will share this privilege with all of you is, again, one of the many reasons that we are very happy to have all of you. So, Miguel, many thanks for enjoying sushi for the first thing, and then for speaking to us today, because it will be a real pleasure, I know, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for the invitation, but also so much thank you for the very nice presentation that you've just made. I have to say I feel both fascinated and at the same time fearful after the last panel that I had the opportunity to hear a good part because I was late. And in fact, I was just saying to Pedro, we could have thought even of having a conversation about sports, because last week I was giving a talk in Barcelona precisely about some of the issues that were being discussed in the panel. So I feel tempted also of starting the conversation on those issues, but I'm sure we'll have an opportunity over coffee break to engage on some of those with you. And today what I'm going to talk to you is about, I would describe it as democracy being in crisis in a context of crisis. That democracy is in crisis, I think we all hear about quite often. We hear claims that democracy is in crisis, that populist forces are growing, that there are increased tendencies, authoritarian tendencies in some of including European democracies, but not only, that there's a move away from liberal democracy, understood as democracy not meaning only majority voting, but also mechanisms of checks and balances, of separation of power, of pluralism, of freedom. But there's also another way that we can measure the extent to which democracy is in crisis. And this is actually by the satisfaction that citizens show or not with democracy. And almost all empirical studies that we have that try to measure that, basically asking people, are you more or less satisfied with democracy today than you were in the past, show a decrease in the levels of satisfaction with democracy. So democracy is still by far the political regime that citizens prefer. But it is the levels of satisfaction with that political regime, with democracy, have been decreasing steadily in the past years. Now, first question is to try to think why it is. And there's basically two ways that are traditionally used to measure the extent of legitimacy of democracy. One is input legitimacy, that is, democracy is perceived to be the system of government that allows for self-government by having the mechanisms that give voice to the people in running their own destinies, the instruments of participation, of representation. And therefore, the way to measure this is by trying to define the extent to which people actually trust that those that are in power in the democratic system actually represent them and are defending their interests. And to a large extent, one of the reasons that explained the drop in the levels of satisfaction with democracy is precisely that input legitimacy has been in crisis because increasingly people trust less and less in political elites, in their representatives, and therefore that they feel that the mechanisms that are put in place in democracy are not enough as instruments of their voice and to represent their interests. But there's also another way of trying to explain the crisis of legitimacy of democracy, that is by looking at output legitimacy. For many years, for many decades, democracy was related with higher levels of economic development and economic growth. So democratic regimes had a very strong correlation with the levels of economic growth. And it was thought and argued that democracy, therefore, was the regime that actually produced better results for people, that actually improved their economic well-being, their welfare, and promoted stronger economic growth and social and economic development. This has been put in crisis by, on the one hand, in many democracies, Western democracies, the fact that we're witnessing increasing levels of economic stagnation. So the economies are not growing as they were of democratic regimes. And in some instances also, not in always, not as much as sometimes is made to thought, but that's a discussion we can have, but also some instances or some dimensions of increased inequality. And that is also, that also undermines that correlation between outcomes and democracy. But at the same time, people and citizens see that there are regimes that are not democratic, that are having actually much higher levels of economic growth, particularly China, making those regimes more appealing in terms of their perceived effectiveness in dealing with the problems that our societies face today. Now, what I want to briefly talk about with you before having the conversation with Pedro is the extent to which we can explain, on the one hand, what may explain these two challenges of legitimacy that in turn explain the decreased levels of satisfaction with democracy, and relate them with the crises that our societies are facing today or faced in very recently, particularly the pandemic and now the Ukraine war. Two very disruptive but exogenous crises in the context particularly of European democracies and American democracy. And in part, this was what I tried to do in a book I co-edited with an American colleague, Paul Kahn, and that we published together, called Democracy in Times of Pandemic. And that we started writing immediately 2 months after the pandemic started to appeared in Europe. In fact, we started in early May, so even less than 2 months, and in the United States. And because we both have been studying and working on democratic issues recently, and we were interested in trying to understand and anticipate, foresee, what could be the possible impact of the pandemic, and now the second crisis, the Ukraine war, in democracy. And particularly in amplifying or mitigating the risks and challenges currently faced by democracy. Now, let me start, before trying to address the current crisis, let me try by very briefly trying to identify what may explain some of the ongoing problems our democracies face. And I usually link them with what I call a transformation in the nature of politics. And this transformation in the nature of politics is a transformation on the time, mode, and space of politics. I have to be very brief, but in the discussion we can go more into depth into that. But the transformation in terms of time is perhaps the one that is more easily understood because it's more easily discussed, is the extent to which our public sphere and our politics is increasingly dominated by the short term. Everything, the news cycle is 24 hours. That determines an impact on the nature of political incentives. And a lot of the issues that we face today, the issues of environmental sustainability or social sustainability in terms of, for example, the impact of democracy. Portugal has a particularly serious problem in that, but other countries also have on the sustainability of welfare states. They are all long-term, while at the same time, the structure of political incentives focuses on the short term. And this symmetry is one of those that conducts increasingly to problems in the way politics works and the difficulty of politics, of dealing with the problems that society faces. But the second change is in the mode, regards the mode of politics. That is the extent to which democracy today has been losing the forms of intermediation that were classic of democracy. I mean, first, think about the extent to which there is an increased distrust on elites, not only political elites, but also journalists that I used to call the editors of our democracy because they edit our public space, but also trade unions. The loss of these intermediation spheres and the loss of trust on these elites in turn leads to a democracy that is increasingly disintermediated. And being more direct is more emotional. People often confuse increased access to information that the digital space brings to them with actual knowledge, when having access to information is not the same thing than knowledge, because in order to understand that information, you need expertise, you need competences. But the reality is that the ease of access to information that the digital transformation has brought to our lives changes the way we relate to that, therefore changes our cognitive processes, changes the way we form our political and our policy preferences. By the way, this doesn't happen only in politics, it happens in many other spheres of life. Think about how decades ago we will go to the doctor will makes a diagnosis, prescribes some medicines, will go to the pharmacy, get those medicines and start taking the medicines. Nowadays, people go to the doctor makes a diagnosis, prescribes the medicines, and then people go on Google to second guess the doctor, basically. And this that you see on that, it happens on every sphere of society, including, and I would say even more, on politics. This disintermediation of politics takes away rational dimensions, makes politics much more emotional, changes the way that political preferences are constructed on the part of citizens, and therefore now those political preferences also change the nature of political incentives. New forms of communication, the social networks, I'll talk a little bit more about that just in a minute. They are eroding rationality in politics, and they are fragmenting the political space. Therefore, leading to further polarization and making it harder for democracy to fulfill one of its primary functions. That is that of reconciling opposing interests in the search of a common good. That becomes increasingly difficult in a much more polarized society and radicalized society, and that is a consequence of the change in the modes of politics, how we interact in the public sphere, how our political preferences are formed, and how those political preferences are then transformed into decisions in the democratic system. But the third transformation has to do with space. And it has to do with the fact that the space for politics is increasingly out of tune with the space for policies. I mean, you are a good example of the extent in law too. We know that. I'm a lawyer first and foremost, of the extent to which increasingly, I used to say, the lawyers of today need to be able to travel between different legal orders, as travelers need to be able to adjust to travel within different time zones. And if we don't learn how to travel constantly between different legal orders, because increasingly the legal cases that we face involve multiple legal sources from different national regimes, sometimes national regimes, transnational, international, supranational regimes, sometimes private sources of law, like in sports, other times public sources of law. If we don't know how to do that, we get legal jet lag, and we are in trouble. And citizens face the same problem at the level of politics. Because when many issues increasingly have to be decided beyond our nation state, that is where the political space is still organized, where the political incentives are still formed, then we don't know, for example, what is exactly the extent to which we ought to make our governments accountable for what they decide. Because are they deciding on their own, or are they implementing decisions that are taken beyond our space? I always give an example of the extent of the challenge that we face that goes very, very far in history, the Mesopotamian civilization. There's a book by an Italian-American archaeologist called Bucciolati that talks about the origins of politics. And he identified the origins of politics with the first urban area in the Mesopotamian civilization. It was the first time that the group of human beings lived together without belonging to the same tribe or the same family. They were just there sharing the same physical space and the same resources, mostly water, in that area. And that created the need for politics. And what is interesting is the lesson that we derive from that to the discussions we have about politics today. Why? Because what that tells us is that what created the need for politics was not identity, as we usually think. That is, politics is not the product of a pre-existent political identity, but instead, what created the need for politics was interdependence, sharing the same territory, the same resources, in the context of diversity, not being members of the same family or the same tribes, and therefore having to develop social norms, political norms, to resolve their disputes and decide how to allocate their resources. What we have today, and what made it the other aspect that is interesting is Mesopotamian is also the period when language emerged in a functional way. That is, language was acceptable to be codified and therefore learned by others. And that facilitated creating political forms of organization because you share the same language. And in here you have both the promise and the challenge and the heart of what we face today. We are increasingly interdependent beyond our nation states. But we don't have the common language in that sense. And I'm not talking of language in a more metaphorical sense in here. The forms of politics beyond our states to govern that interdependence. And again, this asymmetry disturbs the processes of accountability, disturbs the nature of political incentives. So, very briefly, this transformation that we've been seeing in politics, the time, mode, space of politics, to a large extent explains the degree and the extent of the challenges democracy faces. Now, what have the current crisis done, and has that mitigated or aggravated these challenges? I have to say it's still too soon, and in some respects they may have aggravated, and in other ones they may have mitigated. Let me just talk about 3 dimensions of this that may be important and that are in that book that I was telling you about. The first one has to do with the modes and with the nature of how knowledge is formed and how a political public space is organized. The first one is trust on experts. What we saw in the beginning with the pandemic crisis and again, even now with the Ukraine war, is the need a reinvigorated trust on experts. Because with an exogenous, radical shock, particularly as it was the pandemic, we needed as citizens, as humans, we needed someone to provide us some certainty, some security. And experts, virologists became the new football stars in the European sense, not the American, or baseball stars of the last couple of years. And the epidemiologists, they were on television, we all wanted to hear them, to know about it. That has led to a reinvigorated trust on experts. But at the same time, and as we're actually anticipating in our book, has the crisis progressed and science demonstrated to be science?
Reading from your introduction, you say that communities, like we all know, have faced natural disasters before. Even pandemics are not a new reality. You write that plague has shaped European history. Smallpox initiated the European conquest of the New World. Disaster does create the condition for political changes. A crisis brings new problems, but it also offers new opportunities. Sometimes we make good use of those opportunities, sometimes we do not. My question is, what do you perceive to be the best opportunities out there for people in this room, lawyers like you, in law firms spread throughout the world, that have a world that, as you wrote, has so many, besides being global, has so many horizontal aspects in common, at the same time suffering the crisis and reacting to the crisis? So that's my first question to you.
I think I still have the mic working. Yeah. Okay. So I think that it's still too soon to know the direction that we will take. But I think that there are opportunities that out there that have been created, or that for which we maybe in some cases have not been created, but for which we have been alerted by this crisis. But of which I'm not sure of the extent to which we'll make use of them. And not only lawyers, but politicians and society in general. Maybe let me give you two examples and of the extent to which that may or may not happen. The first one is that I think the most remarkable thing, that was actually what led me to think about the impact of the pandemic on democracy. The first thing that led me to think about it was the extent to which it highlighted the fact that our political systems were not prepared. I remember talking, as you know, Italy was the first country in Europe where the pandemic really exploded. And I remember to talk with the scientific advisor of the then Italian Prime Minister, by the way, a law professor, at the time, not now. But at the time Conte was a law professor from Florence. And he was telling me that this was March. So those of you, at least the Europeans, know that March, we were hearing Italy was already a case. And that in the Council of the Ministers for Health in Europe, the Italian minister was saying to them, look, you're going to get this. You have to prepare right now, starting to buy ventilators, starting to buy masks, think about this kind of thing. And the other ministers, he said, the resistance of the other ministers was, no, maybe we're not going to get it. Was unbelievable, the extent to which, we're talking about March of 2020 already. We're not even talking of December of November when it was spreading in China, and much less 5 years or 10 years before when Mr. Gates gave the famous speech saying the pandemic is going to be the biggest threat for humankind in the coming years. This tells us that there's something deeply flawed about our political systems about that. And they have to do with two aspects. One is the extent to which politicians, political systems, suffer for something that behavioral science says any one of us suffers, that we underestimate the risks that we are subject to. Every time we pick up a car, we think we have a lower risk of having an accident than we actually do. And therefore, we don't insure ourselves through our behavior or in contractual way or in any other way for the level of risks that sometimes we incur ourselves. And so the political system suffers the same thing, but the difference is that the political system should be designed so as to prevent those risks. We understand, we as humans, is natural, but it's our human nature, we are not rational in everything we do. But when we design political system, and that's something we say in the book, the political system needs to understand that this is a flaw of human behavior, and what political systems mostly serve for is to correct those flaws and to prepare us and to prevent us with respect to those flaws. And the other one is the difficulty of internalizing future risks. And we see the same thing with climate change. And we saw the same thing by the fact that we were completely unprepared to the pandemic. We completely underestimated, never really prepared. And by the way, it would not be enough for a government to have an enlightened, rational being such as Mr. Gates or whoever saying, well, we have to prepare for the pandemic 5 years before, because if any government would have tried 5 years before the pandemic to divert resources from salaries or any other aspect to buy ventilators or to have further research on how to prevent pandemics, what do you think will happen to that government? I mean, they will not be very popular. So this is a problem that has to do with the nature of political system. The only way for us to correct it is to think, how can we design our political systems so that they internalize better future risks? And the pandemic could be an instrument to alert us to that, and therefore to do that not only for the pandemic, but for climate change, for financial sustainability of our states, for a variety of issues where we are currently in our political systems underestimating future risks. And that's, by the way, is a form of democratic deficit, because it means we're leaving it for future generations that are going to have the impact of the bad choices we make today. So that's the first example. The second one I will give, it's the one of the tension between whether this will undermine globalization or actually reinforce it. And there's two lessons possible. I mean, one of the lessons of this crisis, including the Ukraine crisis that we see, and we see it in Europe, is we have to have European sovereignty on certain issues, in certain areas, energy, health, and it's going to happen. Europe is moving in that direction. And what does that mean? Bring back to Europe some of the chains of value, some of the chain of the different elements of the chain of production in areas that are considered to be of particular importance. On the other hand, we also know that if we try, and Europe is an interesting case, because at the same time that this means diminishing the level perhaps of European engagement on global processes of production in some sectors, not in all, in other ones it also means that we will give more power to Europe instead of the member states. Because in order for Europe to be more sovereign in that sense, of more self-dependent as a European market on certain areas, it doesn't mean only some more protectionism towards the globe, the rest of the world. It also means, to do it effectively, to change powers from its member states to the European level. Therefore, for example, the talks now of moving into majority decision-making on a variety of areas. So there's this tendency, and I would say that this is an opportunity, that's why I was giving this example, not necessarily because I'm a defender of protectionism, but it's an opportunity for us to readjust our levels of decision-making to where they are really necessary, and therefore also to adjust the levels of politics that I was mentioning before. That is, that gap between the space where politics takes place and the space of policies that are necessary.
Thank you. On the very first question, I took note we should sue politicians, basically. So
No, that is actually happened. I mean, in France is a very good case of not only suing but criminalizing a lot of political activity.
Decisions.
I don't think it's necessarily good.
Well, at least it will be an area of business. That's what we are looking for here. All right.
In Portugal too.
In Portugal as well, we would have a lot of work. Miguel, you've gone into my second question, and I don't have too many, so I have to go again to it. I was drawing into your European Union institutional experience and background to understand what would happen as you already advanced some areas. You write that in Europe, the current crisis may redefine the ethos of the European Union. And you give examples. Fiscal discipline, the core policy of the euro area has been suspended, and the EU may introduce new forms of risk sharing, double its budget capacity, and de facto acquire tax powers. Besides these areas, especially for the EU and former EU members here, what would you see as, besides these areas, other legal or areas with legal impact that we should look forward to see more activity and more change in the balance that you're just referring to between European central authorities and the member states?
I think, by the way, let me grab a little bit. When we wrote that, there was no next generation yet, so we actually anticipated what was going to happen in that respect. I think definitely one of the areas that the Union is going to evolve is, and if you're talking about in terms of legal work, is tax. Both the creation of, they will call it new EU-owned resources, but they are actually new taxes. They may be collected through national tax authorities. I don't think the Union will get to have its own tax authority, but it will create taxes that may even be implemented through national tax authorities, collected at national tax level. And I think we will see that in a variety of areas, from carbon emissions to the digital area. I mean, the domains are relatively well known in that respect. And even I don't exclude the creation of a kind of a surtax on companies at EU level, a European additional to a corporate tax as an alternative to full tax harmonization. I think that the current crisis in Ukraine is leading European politicians in the direction that they thought and they actually didn't want to go. That is actually, they're going to have to amend the treaties. What Macron has said, what Draghi has said, now really opens the door to amending the treaties. What is a Pandora box is that everyone fears because the last experiences with amending the treaties didn't go well. And one of the main reasons is the understanding that you need majority decision making, more effective, and at the same time, both the expansion that happened in the past and the new expansion that will be necessary to link European integration to European security, with Ukraine, Moldova, all these countries, will make it necessary to have two levels of integration, one of which will be based on the majority principle, not unanimous decision making. I think all is leading in this direction. And if you go there, then you have to have the same thing for tax. And the other day I was talking about this with someone, and I said, if I was Luxembourg or Austrian or countries that are traditionally resistant to that, if I was them, or if I was advising them, I would say, agree on something now, because otherwise you will have to agree on something on a worse bargaining position later on. So this is the moment that you are still in a better negotiating position in terms of those kinds of issues. And one of the alternatives to a full tax harmonization may be to maintain the principle of tax competition and instead creating a small, this is a proposal I've actually made in the past, so I'm using the opportunity to to make a European corporate tax that will be limited in its scope, rather limited, and that will be an instrument if you want to regulate the tax competition by saying, okay, we can have tax competition because at least they all have to pay a minimum amount to the European level, and if tax competition will increase a lot, the European tax can be used to mitigate the risks of such tax competition. Anyway, the proposal is more complex in other respects, but that's one of the areas that I think we are going to see. I mean, in terms of legal work, I think there will be a lot of legal work on sanctions, on target sanctions, if you are into that area of work. As an advocate general, that probably led me to decide my most famous case, the Cadi case. I was the advocate general on that case, and I think there's a lot of that is going to continue because the tradition that the Americans and now Europe have created in this respect, and that's being used with respect to Russia, will continue to be used across the world. Increasingly, countries will want to not to be directly engaged in wars, but to fight them through financial means and financial sanctions, target sanctions. That's what we're seeing. And for lawyers, that's a terrific field of work, at least.
I
would say sports, by the way, is another, but that's for different reasons. Just my.
So one last question, and then I'll just have any of you make a very final question, or more than one quick ones. This is for the lawyer and for the law professor. You also write in this introduction that the pandemic has offered a crash course in collective responsibility. You say that our social space to be free, we all have we have to be responsible. It is enough now that one of us is not safe for all of us to be unsafe. But the pandemic has also shown how this collective responsibility is very hard to develop. Free riding is rampant, you're right, as individuals neglect social distancing rules, for instance. So my question is there another kind beyond contractual liability, beyond civil liability? Is there going to be some social liability to be derived from the experience that we have endured? And is there an urge and a need for it? Because as we have a sense, this health crisis is probably just the beginning of other health crises, and at least in this sense, we should try to prepare ourselves. What do you think about that?
Well, first I think the difficulty of managing collective behavior that we saw during the pandemic is a lesson for all of us lawyers. That I always say to my students, one of the biggest mistakes we do in law, and we do it a lot in Portugal, is to believe that rules have a causal relationship with society. They don't. They produce a set of incentives that can sometimes lead even to outcomes different than the ones that you wished. And if you don't understand that, if you think that, oh, I've put this in a rule, therefore it's going to happen, that's a mistake. But the second aspect that is important is that the second order mistake that is done on that is to believe that that system of incentives operates with respect to humans that are fully rational, and we are not. And so that's the insights for behavioral science. That's something that I've worked a lot, and I think that in Portugal we're not even at the first level. I used to say in Portugal we needed more economic analysis of law, and I think in the world we need more behavioral science of economic analysis of law. And in Portugal we are even at the first level, unfortunately. But in general, one of the things that this shows us is that the way we have to understand how humans behave and how you can try to create incentives for one behavior or another is linked to dimensions of us that are not rational too. But the fact that they are not rational doesn't mean that they are not foreseeable. And therefore, a lot of the irrational behaviors that we have are predictable. we can know them in advance, and therefore we can develop legal rules that anticipate them and mitigate the risks of that, and take that into account. So that's the first thing. When we think about legal rules, we need to think about the system of incentives that they generate, and that system of incentives, in turn, cannot assume that human beings are only rational, and we have to take into account patterns of irrational behavior. That's the first thing that I wanted to say in that respect. There was a second point, let me see if I remember, on the rules that you were mentioning, the rationality. Can you repeat that?
Well, if we can perceive an evolution from civil liability into collective.
That's the other thing that we also saw during the pandemic, and we're seeing in general in life. It's that we shape, including through rules, human behavior, not only through forms of liabilities, civil, criminal liability, but we will increasingly have new tools, including regulatory tools, to do it. I mean, then social credits that the Chinese are experimenting with. For example, when you, and we already have them in our societies. I mean, when your credit assessment is based on certain aspects of your behavior in life, that's forms of indirectly controlling or guiding you in one direction of behavior or another. And in some respects, those things can be instituted by governments through law. Law might impose that people with certain kinds of risk behavior, and in fact it already does, don't have the same access to certain forms of insurance than other ones don't have. So the idea of social credits, that even Black Mirror has a beautiful episode that leads of that to the extreme, is not something totally new. And what I think that you will see in society is an increase on those instruments. But that also creates tensions, because if law starts to punish you or reward you with respect to certain behaviors, by making use of a very wide spectrum of aspects of your life, that is an intrusion of our level of privacy and on our level of what we are as social beings, that is also highly problematic.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Is there any burning question from the audience?
I think you may tell people that
Yeah, of course.
Sure.
Yes, the episode you should,
Of Black Mirror.
Yeah, and Miguel will be around and tell you exactly what episode it was, and anything else that you want to take the benefit.
I'll be happy to talk to you.
The benefit to talk with Miguel. Miguel, thank you very
so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.